Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the North Carolina Museum of History Community Class Virtual Series. My name is Krista Regan, and I'm the Education Section Chief here at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us for this, our fifth NC Community Class program. We created this series with the goal of educating and engaging all citizens. This reoccurring educational series aims to explore the historical contributions of underrepresented individuals and communities across our state and nation. By bringing these historical figures, events, and issues to the forefront, the series encourages learning, conversation, awareness, and understanding. We've designed the themes for this season to complement and set the stage for our American Indian Heritage Festival taking place this November. Community class topics relate to the original nations and peoples of the great state of North Carolina. Our September program on Henry Berry Lowry and the Lumbee featured three outstanding historians, Nancy Fields, Dr. Lawrence Locklear, and Dr. Melinda Maynor Lowry. It is now on YouTube for your viewing pleasure. Tonight's program is on the Tuscarora War. We know there were tensions related to settler colonialism that eventually boiled over. But on the morning of September 22nd, 1711, more than 500 Tuscarora warriors and their allies attacked European settlers living along the Neuse and Pamlico rivers of North Carolina. Thus began the Tuscarora War, the bloodiest and perhaps most brutal colonial war in North Carolina history. The conflict would go on to claim hundreds of lives. In this program, two historians will examine the war's key players, reveal its many causes, and consider the long-term effects for the Carolina colony. But just a couple of rules before we get started. I want to share tonight that Ms. Michelle Carr is going to be managing our chat. We invite you to participate by commenting and asking questions. Some of them we will address during the program or at the end of our presentation. We ask that you make sure your questions and comments are respectful and relevant. Michelle will also be sharing important information throughout the evening in the chat and may answer some questions there. Please feel free to highlight this program on your social media accounts. If you're tweeting or posting about the presentation, please use the hashtags NC Community Class and Tuscarora War. Now to the good part. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our presenters are Dr. David LaVere from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington and Dr. Arwen Smallwood of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. Dr. LaVere is a former United States Marine entryman. He is a professor in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington and the author of 7 books on American Indian history, including the Tuscarora War, Indians, Settlers, and the Fight for the Carolina Colonies. Dr. Arwen Smallwood is professor and chair of the Department of History and Political Science at North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, and Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Lecturer for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. His research primarily focuses on the relationship between African Americans, Native Americans, and Europeans in Eastern North Carolina during the colonial and early antebellum period. Dr. Smallwood, if you would take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ms. Regan. I'm going to share my screen with everyone and begin the presentation. I added to my presentation the title, North Carolina's Forgotten Native Nation, the Tuscarora, the Great Tuscarora War and its aftermath. And part of what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the Tuscaroras in terms of background and their general history leading up to the Tuscarora War, and then allow my esteemed colleague, to David LaVere, Dr. LaVere, to take over and talk about the war itself. So I'm going to start with a general discussion about the Tuscaroras being in North Carolina and Virginia before first contact. The Tuscaroras basically are Northeastern Indians, and pretty much the dividing line between the Northeast and Southeastern Indians is the Cape Fear River. So the native nations south of the Cape Fear, the Catawbas, Yamasees, the Creeks, Cherokees. These Indians were Southeastern Indians, while the Tuscaroras were Northeastern Indians. And they were one of the most, or the most dominant group in Eastern North Carolina prior to the arrival of Europeans and the spreading of diseases by the European, and then conflict between Europeans and Native people in the region and in North Carolina. It's also important to note and understand that the Tuscaroras were Iroquois. There are many different nations of Indians, and I explained to people that the nations of Indians are like in Europe or in Africa, you have different language groups, different ethnic groups, the French, the English, the Dutch, the Scots. And so in North America with Native Americans, you have the same thing. You have language groups. And the Iroquois, the Tuscaroras and their kinsmen, the Nottaways and Maharans, were Iroquois, and they dominated Southeast Virginia and Eastern North Carolina. And then the Cherokees were in the mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina. And then there were other groups, of course, Algonquin-speaking people, Muskegon-speaking people, which were the Creeks, and then the Algonquins, which made up a number of different other groups in Eastern North Carolina. The Tuscaroras came into North Carolina historically from the Northeast, and before that, from the Ohio Valley. The Iroquois people lived in the Ohio Valley at the ancient city of Cahokia thousands of years ago, and then they migrated east into New York and Pennsylvania. And then from that region, the Tuscaroras migrate south into North Carolina. And once arriving in North Carolina, the Tuscaroras really split into three major groups. You have the Tuscarora proper, who are in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, and throughout North Carolina. You have the Maharans, who still reside in Hertford County and in northeastern North Carolina on the border with Virginia. And then in Virginia, you have the Nottoway Indians, who reside in southeastern Virginia in and around the Cortland area. For all intents and purposes, the Nottoways, the Maharans, and the Tuscaroras were the same people, linguistically, ethnically, and culturally. And they basically are in that region of North Carolina and Virginia. They come into North Carolina primarily through the river systems. They come down pretty much through the mountains from the Roanoke, from the Appalachian Valley, the Shenandoah region, and Roanoke River Valley, down along the Roanoke, and then populate the Nottoway rivers, the Maharan River, the Roanoke River, and then eventually they will also populate. The I apologize, trying to make sure it advances. They will also populate populate the rest of Eastern North Carolina. So you will see that they start in the Chowan River Valley region, Roanoke River Valley region, Maharan and Nottoway River, and then they migrate down to the Tar River, the Neuse River, and eventually as far south in North Carolina as the Cape Fear River. So all of the major west-east flowing rivers from out of the Piedmont of Virginia in North Carolina down into the coastal areas are the rivers that the Tuscarora will basically settle along and migrate to and build villages all along those rivers in Eastern North Carolina. The Cape Fear or Petey Yadkin rivers kind of separate the Yamasees and the Catawbas and the Southeastern Indians from the Tuscarora, but pretty much the Piedmont of North Carolina and Eastern North Carolina is dominated by the Tuscaroras, and it's part of their hunting grounds. The Tuscarora will be made up of several clans, a total of 7 clans. Snipe Clan, Eel Clan, Bear Clan, Deer Clan, Wolf Clan, Beaver, and Turtle Clan. And they will basically thrive in Eastern North Carolina until the time of the Tuscarora War. It is possible that there were other clans, but at the time of European contact and during recorded history, these are the 7 clans that were in existence during that time period. And again, as this colonial map of North Carolina shows, the Tuscaroras had villages stretching through what today would be Bertie County, Hertford and Halifax County, on down through Edgecombe County, Wilson County, on down towards Snow Hill, but throughout eastern North Carolina, most of the major places like Pitt County and major cities like Goldsboro, Greenville, New Bern, et cetera, would have been settlements and major towns for Tuscaroras, and that would be their hunting areas throughout eastern North Carolina and up into the Piedmont. Because of the Tuscaroras, historic ties to the Iroquois people of the Northeast, they developed trading routes. They traded with various Indian nations in the Southeast, with the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Catawbas, as well as Indians as far north as their kinsmen, the Five Nations, the Mohawks, the Senecas, Onondagas, and Cayugas. But they had a very significant trade. Not only did they have very fertile land in eastern North Carolina that was desired by the colonists, they had very lucrative trade routes and were the middlemen between major trade between the colonies of Virginia, South Carolina, and even as far north, as I mentioned before, to New York and Pennsylvania. And because of this, they are as much a part of the Iroquois Confederacy as the other five nations. They were well respected by the other five nations. And after the Tuscarora War, they will be allowed to migrate to the lands of the five nations and become the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy, the most powerful Indian confederacy in the history of North America. If we look at great native civilizations in North and South America, the Iroquois count as one of the greatest native civilizations, along with the Pueblos, the Aztecs, the Incas, and the various nations, very distinguished nations. There were hundreds of nations of Indians, and the Cherokees and Southeastern Indians were very significant as well. But when we look at great civilizations, the Iroquois count as one of the great civilizations in North America. And because of their relationship with the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina, and the Tuscaroras' access to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and all natives' major trading good, which were seashells, particularly a purplish seashell that existed on the coast of North Carolina, we will see that they dominate the trade in wampum. And I'll take a second here just to mention wampum and seashells, these purple seashells for Native Americans were the equivalent of gold and silver to Europeans. And so they were very, very valuable to Native nations. And the Tuscaroras dominated that seashell trade throughout North Carolina, Virginia, and the Southeast. And of course, these shells make their way to their kinsmen, the Iroquois, in the Northeast. I'm going to try to be very brief because I want for us to understand the impact that European colonization and the impact with contact with Europeans had on Native peoples. We know about, if you study colonial history, you know about the Portuguese and the Spanish and the impact that they had on Native peoples in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. We know about the spreading of disease. We know the warfare that took place, and we understand the devastation that happened to those cultures in that region. But I think what is less known to people is that the Spanish were also in North Carolina, and they also had an impact on Native peoples in the Carolinas, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And that impact, of course, affects the Tuscarora, and it will affect the way in which Tuscaroras interact with Europeans, particularly when the English arrive some generations later. The Spanish were throughout North Carolina and Virginia. The Spanish had a mission in what basically is Jamestown, Virginia today, in which they established the Catholic Church, and they attempted to Christianize the Indians of the Chesapeake region. They patrolled the coast of North Carolina, and they seized Native Americans and they sold them into slavery. So the Europeans, particularly the Spanish, although they dominated Central America, South America, Mexico, they also had an impact on North America prior to the English arriving in 1584-85. De Soto comes through the region, the slaves raid the coast for slaves, and they take Algonquins and any other slaves they can get. Pardo will go into the western part of North Carolina and have an impact on Native Americans there. So there's a Spanish presence, and it impacts Tuscaroras, and it impacts other Native nations that border them, and it leads to major changes in political alliances between Native groups that might not have been allies before, but because of the threat of the Spanish and their impact on them, numbers of groups of Indians throughout the southeastern Virginia region and eastern North Carolina will begin to realign themselves to basically protect themselves from these slave raids and from the impacts of Europeans, particularly the Spanish initially. If we talk about this impact, again, it leads to a massive Native American slave trade. So natives from North Carolina, Virginia, and other parts of the Americas, Florida, are going to be taken by the Spanish, and they're going to be shipped back to Europe as slaves, as concubines and sex slaves for Europeans, even as the Europeans or the Spanish and Portuguese are bringing Africans into the Caribbean and into South America to mine silver, gold, and to work on sugar plantations. So even before the English arrived in the 1560s and 70s, the Spanish are already having a tremendously profound impact on Tuscaroras and other native groups in the South Atlantic and what became the 13 colonies, okay? So what does this impact look like? If we talk about Pardo, for example, in the western part of North Carolina, and his forays into the region in an effort to basically establish a colony in North Carolina and in North America. We're going to see that they have a tremendous impact on the native peoples living along the Yadkin and Petee rivers, as well as along the Catawba River. And the Spanish will raid villages. These drawings are for Bartholomew, who accompanied the Spanish conquistadors on their campaigns throughout the Americas. And they burn native villages. They attack the native people. They kill chiefs, and they take property, and they kill children, and they hang whole villages of men, women, and children. The Spanish are quite brutal in North Carolina and in South Carolina against the native people that are there. They burn people alive. They chop off people's hands and feet. It is a very brutal campaign in the western part of North Carolina and throughout North America. The native people would not soon forget. And so when the English arrived in North America, the native people understand that the Europeans have goods that they need: guns, knives, axes, lead, gunpowder, and they are interested in developing trade with the English and with these Europeans, but they are also very wary of the Europeans because of their earlier interactions with Spanish throughout the region, and they've taken a very heavy toll. I think it also, as a footnote, when we talk about the Tuscaroras say orally in their oral traditions that they dominated North Carolina from the mountains to the coast. But obviously, by the time we get to the 1700s, they are lessened, and they're lessened by disease. The Spanish spread disease throughout North Carolina, throughout the coastal regions, as well as the interior, and that decimates native villages and native people. And the same thing will happen later with the English. So it's important to understand that, the true strength of the Tuscaroras and other native nations in North Carolina prior to the arrival of Europeans is really not that clear because of the loss of life due to disease, and then later the enslavement of native people. This famous map, as you all know, those who study colonial history would know, is the maps drawn by John White and Ralph Lane during their early expeditions into eastern North Carolina. And on this map, if you look closely, and I can't point it out to you now, but you'll see Virginia written across the map. And if you know your maps, you can clearly see this is eastern North Carolina. You can clearly see the Outer Banks of North Carolina. You can see Roanoke Island, the Albemarle Sound. You see the Chowan and Roanoke Rivers. And then you'll see to the north, just where the mountains and forests began in the center of your page, just to your left of there, you will see Monogoks, written kind of small. Well, the Monogoks are the Tuscaroras. I mean, Tuscaroras were in North Carolina. The English didn't know a great deal about them, but they knew they were there. They knew they were to the west, and the coastal Indians had mentioned that they were a very warlike group that lived to the west, and they lived in concern and fear about the Tuscaroras. So the English knew of the Tuscaroras. They lived in long houses, as you can see again with these drawings by Ralph Lane. It's very similar to the Spanish drawings of the native villages. Long houses are distinct from the homes of the Muskegon people and the other native peoples that live in the Southeast. And so you can clearly see that although they encountered Algonquins, these are Algonquins who have interactions with the Iroquois and with the Tuscaroras. And this would be a representative of a typical Tuscarora village as well. And this one, you see the village, you see gardens, you see corn, you see squash, you see tobacco. I mean, you can see, you know, a very developed village with a very sophisticated social structure and agricultural structure. So the Tuscaroras had a very well-established community, very well-established society. They were hunters, they were fishermen, they hunted and gathered. And so again, we have a clear understanding of the culture of the people in the region prior to the arrival of the English and prior to the Tuscarora War. This is a map drawn in 1597 of Eastern North Carolina and Southeastern Virginia. The red area to the south here is North Carolina. You can clearly see the Outer Banks of North Carolina in the red pink. You see the Roanoke Island there in the water. You see the Albemarle Sound once again. You see the Chowan River, and you see the Roanoke River, and you see Virginia written across the map. So again, the English had some understanding of the Tuscaroras prior to their arrival in terms of permanent settlements, and the Tuscaroras were not keen on the English being in Eastern North Carolina, even at that point. And so we know about the destruction of the settlement at Roanoke, which the Tuscaroras have claimed in legend that they destroyed because they really did not want the English presence in Eastern North Carolina. But the English also spread disease, as did the Spanish. They're successful in destroying Fort Raleigh and thereby driving the English out. The English relocate to Virginia, what becomes Jamestown, and settle Jamestown, Virginia. But they have done damage still to the societies along the Nottoway, Meharrin, and Roanoke rivers and Chowan rivers because they spread disease. If you check the colonial records, you'll understand that everywhere the English went, they spread disease. And it ravaged the Tuscaroras and the other coastal Indians, the Algonquin-speaking people. It ravaged their communities. It decimated them. So even before the English began to get a firm foothold in Virginia and North Carolina and expand into the region, disease has a tremendous impact on these people. And villages that were once thriving and teeming with young people and life and older people are going to be decimated and in some cases even abandoned throughout North Carolina by the time we begin to see significant numbers of Europeans migrate to the region. Okay, this is happening not just in the Roanoke, Meharrin, Nottoway River Valley areas, Chowan River valleys, but it's happening in the Tar, the Neuse River Valley, as well as the Cape Fear River Valley. So this is to kind of set the stage that even before the arrival of the English and even before we see the conflict that will lead to the Tuscarora War, Tuscarora society and the societies of other native peoples in the region have already been impacted in a very negative way. And so one of the things we see happening is we see alliances beginning to reform and take form. When many native people are decimated by disease, then those native peoples will turn to other native peoples and they will reforge alliances. And so the Tuscaroras end up taking in many Algonquin people and creating new alliances with groups like the Machapungas, the Bear River Indians, the Mattamuskeet, the Chowanokes, the Hatteras, the Core, the Neuse, the Pamlico. So numbers of Indians that were in the coastal areas that are impacted by these early explorations by the English will shift their political alliances, and we will see the region beginning to shift and change. But the Tuscaroras are clearly the most dominant group in Eastern North Carolina and in most of North Carolina during the early colonial period prior to the arrival or the establishment of white settlements in Eastern North Carolina. Here's another map of Eastern North Carolina showing again it as Virginia. And you see again on this map, the Monogoks, which again were the name for the Tuscaroras. Okay. Same with this map as well. These are early maps from the 1600s, early 1600s. So now I'm moving closely, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in a moment. We talk about, the English moving into North Carolina. So they get a foothold in Virginia, and they come down from Virginia into northeastern North Carolina first. So the first part of North Carolina that's going to be settled is going to be the Albemarle region, and it becomes known as Albemarle County. And most of the native peoples that were in the region are going to basically be forced out of the region. If they're not destroyed by disease and warfare, they're going to be enslaved by the white Virginians who are moving into the area. And so many villages pick up and they move from northeastern North Carolina over to where the Tuscaroras are proper and come under the protection of the Tuscarora, or they settle in Tuscarora hunting grounds in the Piedmont. So we see the Albemarle County beginning to grow, and it includes, Bertie County, Hertford, Halifax, Northampton, Perquimans, Pasquotank, Camden counties in the Northeast. And as these settlements grow, and we see more whites moving down into northeastern North Carolina around the Great Dismal Swamp, there's going to be increased conflict between the Nottaways, the Meharrans, the Tuscaroras. And remember, the Nottaways and Meharrans are the kinsmen of the Tuscarora. At one time, they were one people, all of the same blood and the same people, but they are in alliance and they create a confederation. And with the other Indians in the region in eastern North Carolina, the Algonquin-speaking groups like the Machapungas, they see the expansive nature of the whites. They see the enslavement of Native American women and children, the killing of Native American men, and they are configuring an alliance to stand against the English, moving from the east and southeast into their territories, and to try to prevent them from, further encroaching on their land and on their territory. As you see, again, they moved down into northeastern North Carolina from Virginia, and then they began to, move down into eastern North Carolina. So it's important to understand that at the start of the Tuscarora War, the Tuscaroras were up against the English, who were coming down from Virginia and moving into New Bern, moving down into what we called Little Washington, but Pitt County region. And so they are concerned about the fact that their Native Americans, their people are being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And so at this point, because of the conflicts between the English, it's a double-edged sword. They need the supplies that the English have. They need guns, they need knives, they need axes, they need gunpowder. So they have a trading relationship with the English, but the English are also aggressive and they want more land. And they're taking additional lands, and they're taking their people and they're selling them into slavery. And that is one of the major reasons for the cause of the Tuscarora War. So I'll stop here and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. LeVere, who will discuss the war itself.
Thank you, Arwen. If you unshare your screen, I will share mine. There we go. Okay, so the spark that's going to actually start the war is the trial of John Lawson and Baron Christoph de Graffenried. John Lawson was Surveyor General of the colony of North Carolina, and he'd been getting a pretty bad reputation with the Indians of eastern North Carolina. Everywhere he went with his surveying equipment, Indians lost land. And on the heels of surveyors came these rather haughty settlers who saw really nothing good when their Indian neighbors. And so Indians began to find themselves not only enslaved, as Arwen spoke about, but also they would be abused. For example, an Indian going hunting on a settler's land might find him beaten, his guns confiscated or broken, and any game he shot confiscated. Indians often wound up murdered by the settlers, their neighboring settlers. And so John Lawson kind of becomes the face of what the Indians were against. Everywhere he goes, Indians are losing land. And so one day in early September of 1711, he convinces his client, Baron Christoph de Graffenried, to take a trip up the Neuse River. De Graffenried had, the year before, had brought over about 350 or so German and Swiss settlers. They settle at the mouth of the Neuse River. They found the town of Newbern. The colony begins to prosper. And so de Graffenried wants to expand up the Neuse River. Unfortunately, that takes them directly into Tuscarora territory who's pretty much, at least, I don't want to say controlled, but pretty much under, again, even the authority is too much, but under King Hancock of Katechna Town, which is on Contentnia Creek, about where the town of Grifton is today. Well, these two officials, they take two enslaved Africans with them to row the boat. And they have two Indians who can speak English riding horses. And they go unannounced up into Tuscarora territory. They forget the diplomatic niceties. They go into Tuscarora territory. Word gets out that these two officials are up there looking around at land without having inform King Hancock that they're there. And so Hancock wants them to observe the diplomatic niceties, come pay respects to them, at least announce that they're there. He sends his warriors to turn them around as they go up the Neuse River, turn them around, come back up Contentnia Creek to Contechna. But instead, the warriors go, about 60 warriors, and they capture de Graffenried, Lawson, and the two enslaved Africans and march them up to Contechna. And there, things kind of get out of hand, but Lawson and de Graffenried are put on trial. And they're actually given a 2-day trial, and where all the Indian leaders from all the various villages in the area come and observe. And so he does. He gets a 2-day trial where he is accused of land loss and of taking Indian land and causing the abuse. And instead of being humble about it and probably talking his way out, he gets very angry. He starts insulting. And not only that, he starts threatening the Indians and telling you what's going to happen to them now and how they're going to pay. And essentially, he loses the gallery. People who had spoken in his favor now turn against him. And the Tuscaroras and their allies realize that if he's going to do or have done to them what he says, there's really no use in keeping him alive. And so eventually de Graffenried will be held captive for about 6 weeks until he signs a treaty of peace, but Lawson will be executed. And one of the great myths is that Lawson was stuck with lighter wood, pine slivers, pitch pine slivers, and then set on fire. It makes a great story, but it's not what happened. His throat was cut with his own straight razor. And we have some of the, one of the Africans who witnessed it told de Graffenried what happened. And Virginia Governor Spotswood, his informants told him what happened. But I mean, he was still just as dead. Now with the Indians realizing that, well, they've just killed this high-powered official, there's going to be hell to pay. And so they might as well strike first, and they do. And my thing is not advancing now. Let me stop share and share this other one real quick. See if this one does it. Let's see. There we go. Sorry about that. And so on the 22nd of September, 1711, what I call the Katechna Alliance, which is made up of the lower Tuscaroras, kind of headquartered around the town of Katechna, along with the Coors, the Bay River Indians, sometimes called the Bear River Indians, the Neuse River Indians, White Oak River Indians, the Mattamuskeets, who are Algonquian speakers, the Pamlico Indians, who also were Algonquian speakers. They all aligned together. And on this date, which is the equinox, the autumnal equinox, they attack at dawn on the 22nd. And this disorganized North Carolina colony is hit hard. The Indians, these warriors hit the English, the German settlers, even African slaves are killed. About 140 men, women, and children are killed. 40 are taken captive and taken back to Tuscarora villages. and an untold number are wounded in these attacks. And it is just really complete devastation. Houses are burned, farms are burned, ships are burned. You have a few main stronghouses, particularly belonging to people involved in the Indian trade who tended to really kind of make almost little small fortifications themselves. House forts, they survive and they take in survivors. But for about 3 days, there's just this rampage over eastern North Carolina, all the way from Bath and the Pamlico River down to the White Oak River in the south. It should be noted that this was not an attempt to destroy the colony. It wasn't trying to wipe out the English, but it was trying to correct English behavior. The Indians had often complained and the colonial government just ignored them. The colony has very little idea of what's taking place with the Indians just to the west of the line of settlement. So this is trying to teach them manners in a way. This is a very severe lesson. It should also be noted that not all Indians in eastern North Carolina joined the Catechna Alliance. The upper Tuscaroras along the Tar and Roanoke rivers, led by King Tom Blunt, did not join in the alliance, did not make war. Neither did the Yopams or the Meharans or the Shawans or the Hatteras. They all tried to remain neutral in this, or at least neutral as long as they could. Well, North Carolina was weak at this time. They were almost in their own civil war with Carey's rebellion. The attacks just bring life in North Carolina to a standstill. Even people in the Albemarle who were not attacked just flee the colony, head up into Virginia for safety. There's no way North Carolina can fight back. And so they have to appeal to their neighbors. They appeal to Virginia, and Virginia hems and haws and says, well, we'll send some troops if you'll pay a day rate or per diem. And North Carolina doesn't have any money for that. And so Virginia finally sends a few militia uniforms. But they appeal to South Carolina, and South Carolina's all for this. What they see, this is a legal war to take slaves. They see opportunity here. And so they're all for it. And South Carolina appoints Colonel John Barnwell, who lived down around Beaufort, South Carolina, and had close relations with the Yamasees. And he can bring about 120 Yamasee warriors into this. He's put in command, and he gathers an army of about 35 South Carolina militiamen and about 700 Indian warriors, Catawbas and Casabos, and all these Indian allies of South Carolina. And so Barnwell leads his expedition up into North Carolina. He arrives on the west side of Tuscarora territory, is surprised to find that there's no North Carolina troops around. He finds a nearby Tuscarora town of Torhunta, and he attacks it. The Torhunta, most of the people were gone. He arrives like at the end of January. This is the hunting season. Most people are at their hunting quarters. Torhunta is only defended by some women and old men, and it's really hard work. But what Barnwell finds is that these Indians are fighting to the death, and that he's very disappointed. Indian women were the favored slave captives to take and enslave, and these women are fighting to the death. He was very disappointed that at least 10 women died in the fighting. They were the ones that he would like to enslave. After Torhunta, most of his Indian allies, to them, the war is over. They had struck a blow, and they leave and head back to South Carolina. He's left with a very small force of his 35 militiamen and about 120 Yamasee warriors, much too small to make an attack. And so now he moves across to Contentnia Creek. He sees the Tuscarora towns which have been abandoned. At Catechna town, he sees a very large European-style fort had been built. He's not strong enough to attack it. He'll go down the Tar River. He will reach eventually Bath. He'll be resupplied, at least somewhat resupplied. And then in March of 1712, he will have some reinforcements of North Carolina troops, and takes his Yamasee warriors, and they will march up to Catechna. And you can see here on this map, called Hancockstown. And there he will go and besiege this big fort that's called Hancock's Fort, in which the Indians had occupied, had built. And their plan is to hole up in here and let Barnwell try and attack it and try until his supplies worked out. And that's exactly what happens. Barnwell will try and attack this fort twice, about a month apart, and he is unsuccessful. He will actually try and dig under the walls, and we have accounts of Indians and his troops fighting under the walls. He's trying to set these fascines and set them on fire, and the Indians are pulling the fascines out. They can't really attack the fort head on because the Indians have so much ammunition and so much shot. They can just keep blasting out of the firing ports. And there's also captives in there who are begging him not to attack lest they be killed. And so Barnwell, running out of supplies, eventually has to call for a peace treaty. So in April 1712, he offers peace to the Katechna Alliance, and they accept. To them, the war should be over. One of the things he demands, though, at this peace treaty is that Hancock's Fort be dismantled, and the Indians dismantled the fort at Katechna. A peace treaty is made. The Indians accept it as a peace treaty, but the North Carolina government is outraged. That was the one thing they had told Barnwell not to do, is not make a peace treaty. To him, he's letting them get away from here. And so they just turn wholly on Barnwell. So a month later, in May of 1712, the Core Indians, men, women, and children, and others are gathered at Core Town, down at the confluence of Contentnia Creek and the Neuse River. They're there to essentially accept and ratify the peace treaty. And while they're there, they are ambushed by the English. About 50 are killed, and at least 200 are taken as slaves and sold out of the colony. Well, this starts the war up all over again. The Katechna Alliance goes back on the attack, and some say these attacks are worse than the original ones back the year before. North Carolina is still unable to do anything on its own, and they appeal again to South Carolina to send a second expedition led by anyone but Colonel Barnwell. And so again, South Carolina, believing that they can have, that they can take Indian slaves, they send a second expedition. This is to be led by Colonel James Moore Jr., who was a pretty competent Indian fighter, had accompanied his father on attacks down into Spanish Florida, where they attacked the missions and enslaved hundreds of Appalachian Indians. And so he commands this with many of the same officers and Indians from Barnwell's expedition. He comes up with a force of about 33 South Carolina militia and about 900 Indian allies. And in late December 1712, they march into North Carolina, pretty much taking the same route as Barnwell. He doesn't attack any Indian towns because he fears that if he does, he would lose his Indian warriors. Makes his way eventually up into the Albemarle to be resupplied. And then in early March of 1713, Barnwell, with his troops reinforced with North Carolina troops, march out to another fort, not to Hancockstown, but to another town called Neohoroka, further up Contentnia Creek. And there the Indians had built and reinforced a much stronger European fort. And so James Moore will, up in March, and eventually up in, it should be March 1713, he will attack the Neohoroka fort up there. He's very impressed by this fort. He will actually draw a map of it, or have it be drawn. If you can see here, this big crescent is a curve of Contentnia Creek. And there you can see the kind of the D-like structure. It looks like a D nestled in that curve. And you can see it, Neohoroka Fort. And this is a very strong European-style fort when we think of Indians being too conservative in their warfare. But this is rather enlightened warfare. They're ready for kind of a siege here. It did work at Hancock's Fort. They think it's going to work here. And this has bastions and flankers and firing ports and I mean, this is a well-constructed European-style fort. Moore decides that what he wants to do is dig a mine under part of the wall, pack it full of gunpowder, and blow it up. And that way you blow a gap in the wall, and then his troops could flood in. This was classic European-style strategy or tactics here. You blow a hole in the fortification and charge in. Those forlorn hopes go in first. So he actually digs this. You can see these zigzag lines here. Those are his trenches that he's building. He's digging to get closer and closer to dig his mine. And so on March 20th, he has his mine set and he lights the fuse, and nothing happens. The gunpowder is too damp. And so he's kind of back where Barnwell was the year before. He's got this huge fort. The mine didn't work. But this time, Barnwell orders a frontal attack, well, actually attack from many sides. And this begins a 3-day battle here. I mean, when you think about it, most colonial battles take place in an afternoon and then it's over with. But this is a 3-day hard-fought battle. So on the 21st, he orders a charge. And what he's able to do that Barnwell was able to set this fort on fire. And so every time they start taking fire from a bastion or a flanker, they throw in fire and it starts setting fire. At the end of the first day, they're just barely inside. They're stuck between the wall and a berm inside. The second day, they're fighting house to house in here, burning it out as best they can. Finally, on the third day, the Indians, the surviving Indians, have taken refuge in bunkers, underground bunkers in the middle of the fort. They refuse to come out. Moore knows that if he sends troops in, it's suicide. And so what he does, he sets them on fire. He sets these, fire begins to rush out, and the bunkers eventually collapse, killing massive numbers of Indians in here. And so at the end of this battle of the Neohoroca Fort, at least over 500 Indians are killed. About 300 of them are killed in those bunkers down there. They've done excavations of those bunkers and they can see the fire, and they've found the remnants of people and goods in there. Others are killed around the fort, and about between 800 and 1,000 are taken as captives and marched away as enslaved people to the slave pens of Charleston, South Carolina. There, many of them are sold to the sugar islands like Barbados, and believe me, you don't live long as an Indian slave in Barbados, 2 years at the most. Others are sold to rice plantations. Most of them are sold out of the colony. But again, up to probably pushing close to 1,000 there. To this day, if you go to Snow Hill, that is where Fort Neohoroca is, there is a memorial there to this battle. Very tragic battle there. And so the war will kind of drag on till 1715. The last holdouts are the Core Indians and the Mattamuskeets. They fight kind of a guerrilla war, and they'll finally sign a peace treaty in February of 1715. And so then now comes the peace, now comes the afterword, which is in some ways even more interesting than before the war, because one of the things that takes place, one of the results is that now these Indians are, even those that did not participate are either neutral or kind of sided with the English, such as the Meherrin, the Shawan, the Yopum, the Hatteras, and the Upper Tuscaroras. They all are made into tributaries, and they're all giving land reservations. When you think of reservations, you think of reservations like out in the American West, but North Carolina had their reservation. The only two that fought the English, that survived, are the Mattamuskeets and the Core Indians. And so they're given a reservation out on near Lake Mattamuskeet. Many of the others, such as the Bay River Indians, the Neuse River Indians, the White Oak River Indians, the Pamlico Indians, they all disappear from the colonial records about this time. And so really it's what happens afterwards, and especially this reservation life throughout the rest of the 18th century, that I find very fascinating. And I would like to turn it back over to you, Dr. Smallwood, to maybe talk about, start at wherever you want to go, but talk about Indian Woods and how that becomes the reservation for them.
Well, and I'm going to use a few more illustrations and note that this war was a far larger war than many people realize. And after the colonists ended, the Tuscarora War was really a continental war. It affected all of Eastern North Carolina and also the entire Eastern United States. The Six Nations, or the Five Nations, became the six. The Mohawks, the Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas all did come into alliance with the Tuscaroras, and they took revenge against the Cherokees, who were the major native groups from the Southeast that fought in the war, the Creeks and the Yamasees. So when we talk about Indian Woods, you have to understand Indian Woods was an established reservation, but again, one of the things that happens is that this sets off a continental war in the backcountry between Northeastern Indians and Southeastern Indians over the Native American slave trade. And it leads to what I call the Tuscarora diaspora. As we've already talked about, it starts during the war, in which Native Americans are enslaved and shipped to the Caribbean, and then it accelerates as a part of the war. Hundreds of Tuscaroras are going to be taken to Charleston, South Carolina, and then shipped out to the Caribbean. And this is an advertisement for a Carolina Indian boy. This advertisement is from 1713. So just to reemphasize what Dave has said, again, this was a major conflict, a major war in which we see, the Tuscaroras being impacted during this area. And we see this huge migration. So we see the establishment of Indian Woods in Bertie County as the Tuscarora Reservation. And that's what the dot here indicates, Indian Woods. But from Eastern North Carolina and from Indian Woods, we see what I call the Tuscarora diaspora. We see Tuscaroras on what's called the Tuscarora Trail, leaving North Carolina for the lands of the Five Nations and settling with their kinsmen, the Oneidas and the Senecas and Cayugas and Onondagas. And we also see them going to Canada and settling at Kahnawake with the Mohawks of Kahnawake. So we see them going out west, into the Ohio Valley with the Peoria Indians. They scatter, they go down into Robeson County, but they move throughout that region. But Indian Woods is seen as, and again, I call it the Tuscarora diaspora. You can find remnants of the Tuscaroras all throughout Virginia, North Carolina, throughout the Appalachian Valley, the Shenandoah Valley, the Upper Tennessee Valley, all throughout West Virginia and into Ohio. You'll see them scattered even into places like Michigan and Wisconsin with the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. So there's this macro and then there's this micro as the English pushed the Tuscaroras out of Eastern North Carolina and into the Piedmont. And then of course, Bertie County, where Indian Woods is located, again, becomes a major point for Tuscarora activity as Tuscaroras come from the north back down to the south to check on their people and check on their land. But using the different road systems in North Carolina, we're going to see this, this migration out. I threw these in and we're going to come to Indian Woods proper, but I wanted people to understand with this diaspora. During the war, the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Yamasees, the Catawbas, and white slavers, take hundreds, if not thousands of Tuscaroras and enslave them and take them back to their territories. The natives do back to their territories. Tuscaroras who flee North Carolina and flee the violence are taken in by Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, Oneidas, Mohawks as they move, and they also are absorbed by Mingos, which are a mix of Tuscarora and Seneca, the Monacan Indians, as well as Nanacoats and Shawnees and Delaware Indians. So Tuscaroras are scattered all over the Eastern United States and taken in by all of these groups of Indians, and they reconstitute themselves in New York as the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy, as the Five Nations bring them in and make them the sixth nation. That's important because even after being shattered in North Carolina, being, as you just outlined, Dave, destroyed in North Carolina and scattered throughout North Carolina, they are still powerful enough that when they arrive in Pennsylvania and New York, they are given the honor of becoming the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois took in the Delawares, they took in the Shawnees, they took in a host of Indians who lost their land in the Northeast, but they gave the honor of becoming the sixth nation to the Tuscaroras. So it is a history that is really lost and not really talked about in terms of how significant this group was. Now, in terms of Indian Woods, I'm just going to show Indian Woods to the readers. These are all maps of the various places that they went. But for Indian Woods, as Dave just talked about, it's in Bertie County, North Carolina. It still exists. The Indian Woods Township still exists, but it's about a third the size of the original reservation. The original reservation included parts of the southern part of the Windsor Township along the Roanoke River. But the core community is still there. Indian Woods Baptist Church and the communities that make up Indian Woods are still there. The peoples, the remnants, the descendant people of these Tuscaroras who were enslaved and mixed with Africans are still there. So the community is still there. And Indian Woods was significant in North Carolina history as a major reservation in Bertie County. The Tuscaroras leased land from the reservation. And in fact, when they sold the reservation, they were able to use the money from the selling of Indian Woods to purchase their current reservation in New York at Niagara Falls today. So these are just the historic images of the Tuscarora, of the Indian Woods Reservation. And I point this out because a lot of the mixed Tuscaroras who live there today, when the Tuscaroras left, they were very familiar with the fact that they had left some of their people behind who were mixed with Africans. And if you read the letter that they sent to the State Assembly in the 1800s, this letter is from 1801, they point out that they are very affected by having to leave their kinsmen who are mixed with Africans in North Carolina, because according to North Carolina law, they have become slaves. So again, a long relationship between Tuscaroras and African Americans in terms of mixed race throughout the community. This is the Rasco family. I just put it in to kind of illustrate that mixed race in the community that you still see today in terms of families that are mixed. Like I said, this is the Rasco family. There were many mixed families in Indian Woods today who clearly are of Native African and European heritage, many with green, blue, gray eyes, who still live in the area. Okay.
That's a good point, is that the 18th century for these Indians living on these land reserves is a tragic but also fascinating time. On one hand, all they have left to sell to make money is their reservation land. The deer hide trade is faltering. You might can sell a little bit to a general store, but when you needed cash, when you needed money to pay taxes or just to pay court costs, you had to start selling land. And so throughout the 18th century, these North Carolina land reserves are slowly sold off piece by piece. And it's not always, and many times, people of the reservation fought their leaders over it, didn't want it, but often leaders would sell this for a few $100s, and sometimes for even much less than that, until by about 1800, all of them have been sold off. And then right after, the last of the Tuscarora reservation would be sold off. And so just dealing with this land loss, and the problem is that the way North Carolinians saw it, white North Carolinians saw it, is that Indian people lived on Indian land. If you lived on an Indian land reserve, then you were an Indian. The problem happened is that when you got rid of that land, if you were an Indian that didn't live on Indian land on a reserve, then in their mind, you weren't Indian anymore. And at the same time, this is where you start having an influx of enslaved Africans and then also free Africans. And so these people often find each other and they marry. And so if you're an Indian not with Indian land, then you start having more and more of the settlers saying, well, it's white. You're not, it's a white and black. You must be black. And so what happens is, by the time you get to the end of the 18th century, you have many of these Indian people being classified as African American. They don't have land, or the land that they claim can be taken from them. And then even worse is that also their children can be taken from them. And this is a thing we see are these forcible indentures, where the county court used to be the governor's council deal with Indians. Now county courts dealt with Indians, and they would take these children and indenture them for until like 10 years old, 8-year-old children, and indenture them till they're like 21, 25 years old to become sailors or coopers or something like that. So what happens to Indians in North Carolina after the Tuscarora War is in some ways even more fascinating, but just as tragic.
Yeah. And just to add as a footnote, many of the Indians were basically taken advantage of, and they were swindled out of their land in many cases, because obviously you have very rich, fertile lands. And I point this out too about North Carolina. You have these rich, fertile lands in Eastern North Carolina that went on to become major tobacco producing lands, and it enriched North Carolina. As you see from the maps, that is the heart of the Tuscarora Nation. That is where they're sitting. They're sitting on some of the best farming land in North Carolina, and not to mention timberland when we talk about, the pine forest and tar, pitch, and resin, et cetera, but certainly some of the most fertile land. So there was always a keen interest by white land speculators and farmers for these lands, and they were getting them any way they could, either legally or illegally. So we want to note that as well, because that does happen.
Another interesting thing that takes place on these, as you move into the latter 18th century, is that the men on the reservation seem to disappear. We don't really know what's happening there. We don't know if they're just moving somewhere else, if they're dying. They're not being enslaved by this time. Indian slavery had ended not long after the Tuscarora War, though there were still Indian slaves. But we just don't know. We just find that more and more women are leading these families. Often they even pass their name down to their children. And more women are serving as, I guess, I don't want to say reservation officials, but will deal with people wanting to buy the land. And we're just not really sure what's happening to these Native American men on these reservations at this time. They just keep seeming to be dwindling and disappearing.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. That was an absolutely awesome presentation. A couple of questions, and we won't be able to get to all of them because this is a very meaty presentation, very complicated, very deep. And our goal with community class is to make people want more. And we know we only have about 10 or 15 minutes, and we may not be able to get to all of them. But in looking through the chat and some other emails, I'll start with just a few. And both of you can chime in as you see fit. Couple of questions regarding Native American slavery. And I'm asking this question primarily on the behalf of K-12 teachers who talk about slavery primarily in terms of West African slavery, the triangular slave trade, and what we talk about typically as a nation. Can you talk a little bit more about the Native American slave trade in terms of the nations in the Caribbean that were a part of that, the numbers of Native folks who were subjected to that trade, and the overall impact?
Well, I can mainly talk about the Indian state in North Carolina. South Carolina was the master and really the driving force between much of this Indian slave trade. This whole area of Eastern North Carolina was just burned over with slavery. In fact, several Tuscarora villages in 1710 wanted to move to Pennsylvania to get away from these slave trades. They can't understand, why would Indian allies of South Carolina be attacking Indian allies of North Carolina? Why are they allowing this to happen? Pennsylvania is all right with it, but they want a letter of good behavior from North Carolina, and North Carolina just ignores it, so they're not allowed to leave. And so this whole area is burned over with these Yamasees and Catawbas coming up here, and they're their women and children are their prime choice, and they march them back. And again, as we said, they work on plantations in South Carolina, sent to the Caribbean islands. And again, you don't live long as an Indian slave. But it's a for obvious reason. It's not a good thing because it angers Indians to be attacked. And what happens, this disrupts the deer hide trade. Deer hide traders at a site, they're being killed because people are upset at being enslaved or their people being enslaved. So it's after the Yamasee War of 1715, 17, that the Indian slave trade itself begins to die out. Arwen, did you want to comment some more on that?
Yes, sure. One of the things, again, I mentioned about the Northeast and Southeastern Indians, and that divide is basically the Catawba River. It's important to understand that the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Catawbas, the Yamasees, these were all slave trading Indians. The Cherokees were going into Kentucky and Southern Ohio and enslaving Shawnees and Delawares, and whom were and became confederated with the Six Nations. So there was a lot of bad blood around this Indian slaving. And as you mentioned, as Dave mentioned, in Florida, the Florida Indians had been Christianized by the Spanish, and they basically were protecting them. They had, they'd become Catholics. They didn't really, didn't have a warrior culture anymore. And the Cherokees and the South Carolinians went in and enslaved over 20,000 of them and forced marched them to Charleston and sold them off into slavery. So the Southeastern Indians were very heavily involved in the Native American slave trade. And when the Tuscarora War erupted, the Tuscaroras fell victim to this on a grand scale. But as I mentioned before, because as Dave just mentioned about the Tuscaroras trying to relocate before the war, this set off a continental war. The Pennsylvania governor had no choice. The Tuscaroras came up anyway, and the Five Nations told the governor that their kin were coming from the South and they were going to settle amongst them. And so they protected them, and they raided villages, and they took Indians who had been enslaved, mixed bloods, Black Indians who had been enslaved, and even Africans, and took them back to New York, beginning what I call the first people to begin the Underground Railroad. They came back to the South to get their people, and they took their people home. And as the last thing I'll mention is that understand that the Southeastern Indians, what we call the five civilized tribes, they continued to practice, even after the Native American slave trade, African slavery. They served as African slave catchers for Native Americans for Africans who were running away from South Carolina. Eventually, they adopted their own. And by the time they moved to Oklahoma, they had huge numbers of Africans who were enslaved that they forced marched to Oklahoma to help them clear Oklahoma. Alan Galay's book on the Native American slave trade and the rise of British America is a very good work, and there are several other pieces that talk about it. But yes, the Cherokees, the Creeks, really, the Catawbas, they were heavily involved initially in Indian slaving and then in African slaving, and they were slaving. They wanted the women for themselves and the children, but they would sell the men for guns, lead, knives, axes, and gunpowder to keep them, armed, to keep themselves armed.
So much more we could cover with that. I mean, that's a series within itself. I'm sure when we talk about the slave trade pertaining to West Africans as well as Native people who had been here for a very long time. The next question, and we're going to move pretty quickly here because I wanted to get at least 3 or 4 questions in. We talked about early on the Spanish influence in terms of disease, conquest, and then moving to English settlements. In your estimation, and this is a question for both gentlemen, could you talk a little bit about if there was some sort of hierarchy, particularly with the Tuscarora, in terms of their dealing with the Spanish versus the English? If they preferred one over the other, had an equal amount of disdain based on those experiences, knowing that we had more English permanent colonies established here. What do our sources tell us about their perspectives of various Europeans who came to colonial North Carolina?
One thing you're looking at is that you're looking at the Spanish are much earlier than the English. So you have the Spanish coming in the early to mid 1500s. And even though you have Roanoke Island in the 1580s and the Mangoax Tuscaroras may have had some, it's really not till the 17 to the late 16 and 17, at least another 100 years, that you start really having this interaction with the English. So my thing is that by the time you get to the Tuscarora War, they're disliking the English a lot more. The Spanish are far away, and it was kind of in the past. The English are then a current threat. And again, you're going to see the war break out over that. The English would it's funny that the English, one of the reasons they gave for colonizing would be that they promised they wouldn't treat the Indians the way the Spanish treated, that they would be much better, and the Indians would flock to them because they would be so much nicer. And it didn't take long before they were just even worse than the Spanish.
Yeah, I would just add that we have to understand that the Europeans provided a new technology. Native Americans did not have knives, axes, they did not have guns, gunpowder or lead. Those were introduced to the native people. And it made life easier, even pots and pans, these cast iron pans and pots. They had clay pots. So they were caught in this situation in which they traded with the Europeans for goods, but they did not forget a wrong, and they did not forgive a wrong. I do believe in the American Philosophical Society, there are oral traditions from Tuscaroras that go way back. And one of those traditions is about the handless maiden. And when I went to the library as a fellow to read through the records on the Tuscaroras, and I read that story about the handless maiden, they had no hands, I thought it was just a story. I thought that maybe they were just telling the story to get the children to behave. And then when I found those illustrations by Bartholomew and understood that that actually had happened, that native people's hands and feet had been chopped off, they had long memories. And one thing about many native nations, they believed in an eye for an eye, and they did not forgive and they did not forget unless things were made right. And so they, I think, dealt with both groups in a very cautious way, understanding that they needed the trade goods that these people had, but they understood that that they had an expansive nature, and they also had a brutal side. And so I think that they, like most people today, you deal with people understanding, who you're dealing with, so that you protect yourself, and your family, if at all possible. And I want to add one last thing about this slaving. We are talking about this academically, but I tell people all the time, would you want your daughter taken as a slave and raped and sold off? Would you want your wife taken as a slave and raped and sold off? Would you want your grandmother killed or knocked in the head, as the Iroquois said, or your grandfather? It's important to understand that these are human beings, and this was a human experience. And because of these atrocities from the perspective of Native Americans, the record is clear how much they loved their children. They loved their children above all. And when their children and women were being kidnapped and sold into slavery, they were incensed. So just have to put yourselves in the position of these native people who have been on the land and living in this land, and this is their home, and then invaders are coming in and not only taking their land, but taking their family members as well.
Dr. LeVere and Dr. Smallwood, one more question, and I want to give you the autonomy to talk about what you think is most important. There are lots of questions, awesome questions, but unfortunately we just don't have the time to go through all of them. So my last question, and this goes to both of you, is what is it that you want people to take regarding learning about the Tuscarora War, and the legacy of indigenous people in colonial North Carolina? And we're getting at the so what of it all. And I say that because we had close to 600 people who registered for this program tonight, and we had over 320 people who have joined us tonight. And so my last question to you is, what is it that you want your students or lifelong learners, retirees, we got teachers, we've got undergraduates who are joining us tonight, people who just want to learn, North Carolina citizens. What is it, the enduring legacy regarding the Tuscarora people that you want the average person to understand?
I'll jump in first here, and I'll give you the last word.
Okay.
That they're still around. There's still plenty of indigenous and native people and Indian people still in North Carolina. I mean, we talk about all that the diaspora, which is a fact, and people being enslaved, but just because they sold their land off, just because they sold when they sold the last of that reservation land off, that didn't mean they disappeared. They were still Indian people. They were still around, and so they may not have the land. And their white neighbors may have said, "No, no, no, you're black. You're not." No, they may be, but they still hold that Indianness inside them, and they're still around. It's only been in the last like 50 years that you start having this resurgence, which is about time. I'm really glad to see that, where people are coming and saying, "No, we're still here, and we still want to be heard." So I would say that even though it's a tragic story, the Tuscarora War, Indian people are still in North Carolina and in eastern North Carolina.
Absolutely.
And I will just chime in on that. I think that's the point, David. As someone who's a native North Carolinian, in the sense that I've been here all my life, and my family goes back multiple generations on Indian Woods, on that reservation, I can tell you that, you know, many North Carolinians, if you trace your ancestry back to early North Carolina, white or black or Native American, all three groups are mixed. They're all in together. Many people in Berkeley County, white, who test their DNA are coming up Indian, black, and white. Many of the African Americans are coming up Indian, black, and white. The things that we do in North Carolina, the foods that we eat, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, tobacco, which built the state of North Carolina. The Tuscarora and Native heritage and Native traditions are at the foundation of North Carolina's people and its society. And if you don't, you have to understand it, because all these things we take for granted, our food ways, our cultural ways, our sensibilities, I mean, we take them for granted, but they're rooted really in Native traditions and in Native behaviors. So I agree with David that, you know, that we know with the Lumbee population, and many of them are part Tuscarora, that we know that, you know, that there is a huge Native population here in North Carolina, the largest Native population probably east of the Mississippi River. And then when you look at people who are either white or consider themselves African American, and you look at their foundations in the Native community, we just have a very unique and very interesting state that I think all North Carolinians, and even people who are new North Carolinians should explore.
Maybe just one last thing, if I had, because I'd like to say, kind of to answer the question you asked, Ms. Regan, is that we live in a modern North Carolina that was affected by the Tuscarora War. The Tuscarora War, after that, the colony of North Carolina was never again, its existence was never threatened again. It was at that time. By breaking the power of the Tuscaroras and these other, once the 18th century belongs to the Indian, and once the colony had dealt with that, then they can start turning to talking about slavery, importing Africans. And that takes us all the way up to the Civil War, where we have this white and black society. And then the Civil War comes, and then afterwards of that. And so what we have now, we can trace it back to that trial of John Lawson and his execution, because it's a tipping point that, in my mind, creates modern North Carolina.
Wow. Well, gentlemen, on behalf of the North Carolina Museum of History, I just want to say thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we're not out of content. These conversations, we hope, will continue. And we know that we've just, you know, scratched the surface of a very complicated and deep-rooted history and issues for our state. And I just want to say thank you to all of our viewers who've joined us tonight. Thank you again to the panelists, but I want to thank Michelle Carr, Joel Rhodes, Allison Booley, all the folks who have made community class possible. So Dr. Smallwood,
thank you,
and Dr. David LaVere, we are so appreciative of you and grateful, and hope maybe we can have you back soon.
Certainly.
So I just want to say thank you to all of our viewers. Stay tuned for another upcoming program on November 9th at 7 p.m. on the Eastern Band of the Cherokee and the Carlisle Indian Schools. We're going to talk about that in November. And again, all of these programs are a supplement to our American Indian Heritage Festival. And we hope that you join us in November for that as well. So I want to say thank you again. Everyone, please be safe and have an awesome evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.